When news broke that Nick Reiner had been arrested for violently attacking his own parents, the public reaction was instant shock and silence. Many waited for a clear confession, but none came at first. Nick denied every accusation, maintaining a cold, distant expression that made it seem as if he were disconnected from the name on the case file. 2 weeks later, inside a freezing interrogation room, investigators presented disturbing photos from the crime scene. At that moment, Nick suddenly broke down, sobbing uncontrollably as years of emotional tension appeared to collapse all at once. That breakdown marked the beginning of a troubling truth, one rooted in long-standing loneliness, resentment, and unresolved emotional pain that had gone unnoticed for years. Few people realized this family tragedy did not begin on the night of the attack. It had been quietly forming over time, hidden behind the image of a picture-perfect family. Nick Reiner grew up feeling isolated, even while surrounded by relatives. As he got older, he drifted into destructive habits, moving from place to place while carrying growing anger and envy. By the time he returned home, he no longer felt like a son, but like an outsider, burdened by bitterness toward his parents and successful siblings. In the same family kitchen that once symbolized normal life, a knife became the turning point that pushed everything over the edge. When Nick muttered that he felt no regret and believed his parents deserved it, his words left a lasting chill. The haunting question remained whether the family was destroyed by the weapon itself or by emotional wounds left untreated for a lifetime. After his arrest, Nick Reiner was held without bail. 2 weeks later, he was brought into a cramped interrogation room under harsh fluorescent lights that reflected off a scratched metal table. He sat hunched over, shoulders sagging, hands trembling as if the weight of the family home rested entirely on him. The anger that once defined him was gone, replaced by emptiness. After hours of silence, Nick finally began to speak, setting off what would later be described as the shocking revelation in the Nick Reiner case. His confession did not come smoothly. Instead, it emerged in broken fragments, each word slow and heavy. He admitted that his thoughts had been overwhelming that day, describing his mind as unbearably loud and chaotic. For the first time, Nick opened up about his childhood and his strained relationship with his father, Rob Reiner. He explained that the distance between them was not caused by arguments or conflict, but by years of quiet emotional separation. Family moments often felt awkward to him, as if everyone else understood how to belong while he stood on the outside, trying to follow along to the public. Rob Reiner appeared to be an ideal father, successful, present, and devoted. He bonded easily with his other children through shared interests and experiences, connections that felt natural and unbreakable. Nick, however, watched from the sidelines, wishing he could be part of that closeness. He later described the family home as safe, but emotionally inaccessible, like an open door without a key. The pressure of living up to the Reiner family legacy, especially with Carl Reiner's towering influence, added to his sense of inadequacy. Though rarely spoken aloud, that pressure shaped Nick's emotional world every day, quietly contributing to the tragedy that would eventually unfold, heavy and unshakable. The weight of Nick Reiner's words settled over the interrogation room when he suddenly described himself as a defective copy, someone who could only repeat but never create. He called himself a shadow of shadows, and those words lingered long after he fell silent again. That sense of isolation had been growing quietly for years, intensifying as Nick entered his teenage life. Exhausted and emotionally drained, he began pulling away from his family, searching for belonging in places that demanded nothing from him and did not define him by his famous last name. In those spaces, he felt momentarily seen simply for existing, and that brief relief made escape feel like peace by the age of 15. Nick's struggles had escalated to the point where his family sent him to a rehabilitation center, marking the beginning of a long and painful cycle. Over the next several years, he would enter rehab repeatedly, each attempt offering hope, but rarely lasting. The Reiner family never hid his struggles or denied the reality of addiction. They continued pulling him back, believing each time could be the turning point. Nick later admitted they never abandoned him, but he felt he kept abandoning himself. Recovery began to feel like waking up more broken than before. As progress was followed by deeper collapses that carried increasing emotional weight, the pressure to live up to the Reiner legacy especially as the son of Rob Reiner and grandson of Carl Reiner, became an unspoken burden that slowly hollowed him out. He lived on autopilot, repeating the same empty days until he reached a breaking point that no one saw coming. Nick drifted through some of the darkest years of his life, moving between states with no direction, no stability, and no sense of a future. Each day felt like a question rather than a beginning, and survival itself became the only goal. Despite the distance and silence, Rob and Michelle Reiner never stopped reaching out. Phone calls went unanswered. Messages disappeared, yet their effort never faded. They faced their son's pain openly, investing time, energy, and resources into his recovery, even when progress lasted only briefly. During rare late-night calls, Michelle listened with quiet patience, while Rob fought to remain calm, always asking if his son was safe. On one call, when Nick said he could not be fixed, Rob replied that he did not need him to be fixed, only alive. That moment captured the depth of a love that refused to disappear. Eventually, Rob realized he could not save his son by force. Instead, he chose to walk alongside him. Their 2015 film, Being Charlie, became a fragile bridge between father and son, allowing them to confront addiction honestly and without illusion. For a time, Nick found structure, purpose, and a reason to wake up. They shared quiet moments together, speaking little but understanding more in the silence than words could express. For a brief period, hope returned. Nick appeared steadier, showing up to work and carrying himself with renewed balance. Those close to the family allowed themselves to believe things might finally change, but the calm did not last. Relapse returned quietly, pulling him back into the same painful cycle. Phone calls faded again, instability resurfaced, and everything he had built unraveled in silence. Through it all, Rob and Michelle Reiner continued trying, even as exhaustion and heartbreak grew. Heavier with every repetition of loss, the promise of success always seemed just within reach. Industry conversations hinted at major deals and global recognition, reinforcing the idea that Nick Reiner was destined to become a worldwide star. Yet behind those promises was a harsher reality. Large sums of money and constant praise created pressure rather than stability, leaving Nick feeling used and misunderstood instead of supported. The real heartbreak was never a lack of effort from his family. They tried until there was nothing left to give. What made the situation tragic was that clarity and understanding always arrived after the damage had already been done. Rob Reiner stood firmly in his role as a father, carrying the full weight of love, responsibility, and fear as he tried to reach his son. Across from him was Nick, overwhelmed and lost. Struggling under the shadow of a famous family legacy, he felt he could never escape. They loved each other deeply, but love alone could not repair the emotional fractures that had formed over many years. About 6 months before everything collapsed in June 2025, Nick returned to his parents' house. He didn't describe it as coming home, only staying temporarily. Without steady work or direction, he depended on Rob and Michelle just to get through each day, asking only for time and quiet. That quiet never arrived. From the earliest weeks back in the house, old patterns resurfaced with alarming speed. The fragile balance Rob and Michelle once managed slipped away. The household became unpredictable, calm one moment and tense the next, as if everyone sensed something looming. Michelle often stayed awake late into the night, listening for signs that something was wrong. Rob tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but exhaustion and constant vigilance showed in his eyes. Nick felt the tension everywhere. Even silence felt like judgment, and he grew defensive, snapping at perceived accusations. When Rob admitted his fear, the honesty only deepened the emotional distance between them. The love in the house still existed, but it had transformed into something fragile and fearful. The emotional gap between father and son, never fully healed, widened again. There were no explosive arguments, only conversations that faded before reaching resolution. Nick wanted to be understood but lacked the words. Rob wanted to protect him, but no longer knew how. Guilt, exhaustion, hope, and disappointment layered over one another until the household felt ready to collapse. They lived inches apart emotionally, yet unable to truly connect. Some days, Nick tried to act as if life was normal. He slept and ate breakfast with his mother and spoke casually about starting over or looking for work. Michelle listened carefully without pressing, knowing that too much questioning could shatter the fragile calm. But sleepless nights returned, and tension settled back into every corner of the house. Rob eventually tried to set boundaries, asking Nick to be honest when he wasn't okay. Nick's response revealed the truth neither of them wanted to face. He didn't always know himself. They were both navigating uncertainty, trying to help without a clear path forward. As the holidays approached, the strain felt inevitable. Years of addiction, recovery, relapse, brief peace, and disappointment had built toward a breaking point. By December 13th, 2025, the family felt it closing in. That night, Nick accompanied his parents to a party hosted by Conan O'Brien, not out of celebration, but because he didn't want to be alone. From the moment he arrived, he felt disconnected. The room buzzed with laughter, familiarity, and belonging, while Nick stood apart, holding a drink he didn't want and searching for something to anchor him. He made awkward attempts at conversation, forcing laughter that never reached his eyes. All the while, Rob watched closely, alert and concerned, hoping to prevent things from unraveling. The atmosphere felt heavy, and Nick didn't know where he'd fit anymore. What began as just another social gathering quietly set the stage for a turning point no one could yet see. As years of unresolved pain followed him into the crowded room, the watchful presence of his father weighed heavily on Nick Reiner that night. An invisible pressure he couldn't shake. In an effort to fight the feeling, he moved quickly from one conversation to another, speaking too fast and inserting himself where he didn't belong, hoping to feel included. Inside his mind, everything felt loud and disconnected. When Rob quietly pulled him aside to ask if he was okay, Nick brushed it off sharply, insisting nothing was wrong. Rob's response was calm but strained, admitting uncertainty rather than anger. That quiet honesty carried more fear than confrontation ever could. It cut deeply. The tension between them didn't erupt immediately. It lingered, building through uneasy silences, short remarks, and glances that said more than words. Nick felt trapped despite being surrounded by people. He accused his father of watching him as if something terrible was about to happen. And Rob admitted it came from fear, not judgment. As their exchange continued, others nearby began to notice. Conversations slowed, laughter faded, and the atmosphere shifted. Nick sensed the discomfort and felt more out of place than ever. When he said he shouldn't be there, Rob didn't argue. His silence made the distance between them impossible to ignore. Nick left the gathering soon after, not because anyone told him to go, but because he felt there was no room left for him. Outside, the cold air made his shaking impossible to ignore. His father's words replayed in his mind, mixing with years of unspoken pain and unresolved emotion. Later, Nick reflected that the moment wasn't about a single argument. It was the result of long-building pressure, exhaustion, and love stretched beyond its limits. The event itself wasn't the cause, but the moment when cracks that had existed for years finally became visible. He would later say that everyone involved was simply worn down. When Nick returned to his parents' house, silence felt heavy rather than comforting. Standing alone, he felt the weight of being physically present but emotionally disconnected. His thoughts spiraled, overlapping and growing louder, until he felt overwhelmed by emotional chaos he couldn't control. He later described wanting the pain to stop, not intending harm, but feeling desperate for relief. That desire for quiet and peace twisted into something he no longer recognized. He wandered through the house, unable to rest, noticing family photos that felt like reminders of a life he no longer felt part of. The loneliness intensified, mixing with lingering anger and years of rejection. In that state, his emotions overtook his judgment. What followed, he later explained, happened during a moment of complete mental collapse. When fear, confusion, and exhaustion drowned out reason, the events of that night would permanently alter the lives of everyone involved in the aftermath. Nick said the anger didn't explode immediately, but settled in slowly, heavy and cold. What remained was not rage, but emptiness. Looking back, That night stood as proof that the tragedy had been building for a long time, quietly waiting for the moment when there would be no way to turn back. Her voice cut through the chaos as she cried out for her son to stop, a plea that struck Nick Reiner with devastating force. In that moment, whatever control he had left slipped away. When the noise ended, the silence felt overwhelming. He collapsed, shaking and staring in disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. Over and over, he apologized, his words frantic and broken. The sound of someone realizing too late that there was no way to undo what had occurred. In a state of panic and shock, Nick fled the house, got into his car, and drove without any real destination. He eventually checked into a small hotel by the ocean, hoping distance might quiet his mind. It didn't. The images of that night replayed relentlessly. Time itself seemed distorted, slowing and then crashing down on him all at once. He later described the guilt as unbearable, a crushing weight that made even breathing feel difficult. He called out his parents' names repeatedly, despite knowing there would be no answer. Trapped in a cycle of remorse, he couldn't escape. When his account ended, Nick sat motionless, his head lowered, appearing emptied of emotion. What remained was not anger, but a profound and lasting regret. The events that followed quickly became public record. Later that afternoon, Nick's sister, who lived nearby, grew concerned when her parents didn't respond to calls or messages. She went to check on them and immediately contacted emergency services. First responders arrived, but it was already too late. The home was secured as the scene of a tragic domestic incident, and investigators began piecing together what had happened. Attention soon turned to Nick Reiner. Authorities determined he had left the house in the early morning hours and was later located at a hotel in Santa Monica. Staff there described him as calm and composed, which stood in stark contrast to the severity of the situation. That quiet demeanor raised difficult questions about what he was experiencing internally in the hours after the AE. As the investigation progressed, forensic findings confirmed that the confrontation had occurred at close range and over a sustained period of time. Those conclusions deeply unsettled investigators and played a central role in how the case was charged. Nick Reiner was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree homicide, 1 for each of his parents. Under California law, this represents the most serious level of criminal charge. Prosecutors also added special circumstances due to multiple victims, significantly increasing the potential penalties. With those additions, the case shifted dramatically. It was no longer about standard sentencing, but about whether Nick could face life in prison without the possibility of parole, or even the most severe punishment allowed under state law. Prosecutors stated they had full confidence in the forensic evidence and believed it met every legal standard required for such charges. What began as a private family tragedy quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal cases in Los Angeles. Investigators assembled a detailed timeline, connecting each action and movement into a single narrative. With no signs of forced entry and a clear sequence of events, the case narrowed sharply. The final step would be the courtroom, where every detail would be examined and tested, and where the full weight of what had happened would be confronted in public view. On the morning of December 17, 2025, Nick Reiner appeared in a Los Angeles courtroom for the first time, marking a turning point in a case that had already captured national attention. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was tense and heavily guarded, filled with reporters, legal staff, and court officials awaiting the next chapter in what had become one of the most closely watched criminal cases in recent memory. Until that moment, the public had only seen fragments of the story through brief news updates and official statements. This hearing signaled the start of the formal legal process, where every word and action would become part of the permanent court record. The courtroom was closed to cameras and live broadcasts, reinforcing the seriousness of the proceedings. When Nick Reiner was escorted inside, the room fell completely silent. What had once been speculation and rumor now stood exposed under the authority of the justice system. Observers quickly noticed that Nick was wearing a high-security protective vest, a measure typically reserved for the most serious cases. Though visually striking, it went unaddressed as the hearing proceeded with a cold, procedural tone. The charges were read aloud clearly and without emotion. Nick Reiner was formally accused of 2 counts of first-degree homicide, one for each of his parents, Rob Reiner and Michelle Reiner. The language was precise and methodical, stripping the moment of drama while amplifying its gravity. When asked if he understood his rights, Nick responded briefly and calmly, offering no additional statement. He did not enter a plea, nor did he react outwardly to the severity of the accusations. His stillness and blank expression left many in the courtroom unsettled. Throughout the hearing, Nick remained motionless, staring straight ahead, appearing detached from the proceedings, as if watching events unfold from a distance. His defense team requested a postponement of the arraignment, citing the need for additional preparation. The judge approved the request without objection. Setting the next court date for January 7, 2026, the exchange was smooth and unemotional, reinforcing the stark, clinical nature of the process. Only near the end of the session did many realize the significance of Nick Reiner's legal representation. Standing beside him was Alan Jackson, a prominent criminal defense attorney, known for handling some of the most high-profile and controversial cases in the country. His involvement signaled that the case was poised to become a major legal battle with national implications. When the hearing concluded, Nick was escorted out quietly under guard, avoiding the press and offering no comment. Both the prosecution and defense remained silent as reporters gathered outside, attempting to interpret what they had witnessed. The Reiner family withdrew completely from public view as the legal process continued. Soon after, a private memorial service was held to honor Rob and Michelle Reiner. The gathering was small, intimate, and deeply personal, attended only by close family members, lifelong friends, and a few trusted colleagues. There were no cameras or public statements. It's just a quiet space for remembrance and grief. At the memorial, Rob and Michelle were remembered not as public figures, but as parents, partners, and friends. Stories focused on their kindness, their humor, and the private moments that defined their lives away from fame. It was a farewell free of spectacle, allowing grief to exist without explanation. Nick Reiner's confession, meanwhile, offered no closure. Instead, it left behind a heavy silence. There were no excuses or attempts to shift blame, only the acknowledgement of irreversible consequences. His remorse did not bring relief, but marked the beginning of a different kind of sentence, one rooted in psychological and emotional weight rather than physical confinement alone. As weeks passed, Los Angeles slowly returned to routine, but the case did not fade from public attention. Media outlets continued tracking every court filing, sealed document, and legal motion. Outside the courthouse, cameras remained a constant presence. Inside the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, Nick lived quietly, rarely speaking. According to reports, he spent much of his time sitting alone, staring at the wall, occasionally writing pages of unknown content. What he was writing and whether it would ever be seen remained unanswered questions as the case moved steadily toward trial. Some believed Nick Reiner spent his days replaying his life in his mind, searching for the precise moment when everything began to fall apart. While he remained largely silent, his defense attorney, Alan Jackson, worked methodically behind the scenes, preparing what many legal experts expected to be one of the most complex criminal defenses in recent history. Legal observers speculated that the defense would rely heavily on mental health evaluations, arguing that Nick was experiencing a severe psychological collapse at the time of the incident. Reports suggested that multiple psychiatrists had evaluated him, each visit reinforcing the seriousness of his mental state. Despite intense public interest, official updates were scarce. The district attorney's office released only carefully worded statements, repeatedly emphasizing that the case represented a profound tragedy rather than a simple narrative of good versus evil. Even media coverage reflected that uncertainty, balancing public outrage with a growing sense of unease and pity. In one of the few letters released through his attorney, Nick wrote that he did not have an answer to the question everyone kept asking. He expressed regret and acknowledged that time does not offer second chances. Those words spread rapidly, reigniting public debate over whether Nick Reiner should be seen as a monster or as someone undone by years of internal struggle. As the trial date approached, the tension in Los Angeles intensified. January 7, 2026, was circled across newsrooms nationwide. With headlines prepared in advance announcing the start of the Nick Reiner trial, reporters crowded outside the courthouse. Cameras and microphones packed tightly together, waiting for even the smallest development. Inside, security measures were extreme. Deputies patrolled silent hallways. Metal detectors screened every entrant, and access was tightly controlled. Veteran journalists remarked that they had rarely witnessed a courtroom, an atmosphere so tense and expectant. When Nick Reiner entered the courtroom under escort, the room seemed to freeze. He appeared noticeably thinner and more withdrawn, walking straight ahead without acknowledging the press or searching the gallery. Dressed in a simple gray suit provided by his legal team, he took his seat as Alan Jackson followed closely behind. The prosecution opened first, presenting the case with a calm but deliberate tone, outlining a series of actions made during a period of emotional chaos. The presentation was restrained, relying on clarity rather than dramatics, which only heightened its impact. When the defense took its turn, Jackson made it clear that his strategy was not to dispute what had happened, but to explain why. He described a narrative centered on psychological breakdown, untreated trauma, and a mind overwhelmed beyond its limits. He told the court this was not an act driven by hatred, but the result of a mental collapse under unbearable pressure. The courtroom reacted visibly, with some attendees showing agreement, while others remained skeptical. Grief, anger, confusion, and sympathy filled the room at once. Throughout the proceedings, Nick remained largely motionless, his expression unreadable. Yet during a brief recess, one reporter noted a subtle tremor in his hands, suggesting the strain beneath his controlled exterior. As the trial moved forward, it became clear that this case was not just about legal facts or verdicts. It was a broader examination of mental health, family dynamics, and the devastating consequences of unresolved pain. By the second week, the Nick Reiner case dominated headlines nationwide, as the public searched not only for justice, but for understanding of how a story rooted in love could end in irreversible loss. Television panels, podcasts, and online forums analyzed every moment of the Nick Reiner trial, examining courtroom footage, facial expressions, and even the pauses in his breathing. But inside the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. What began as a highly publicized case was no longer just spectacle. It became something heavier and far more difficult to witness. That shift became undeniable when the prosecution called its first major witness, Nick's sister, Romy Reiner. Her entrance brought the courtroom to a standstill. Dressed in black and visibly composed despite the weight of the moment, Romy spoke calmly, her voice steady but filled with grief. She described the night she went to her parents' home after they stopped responding to calls and messages. The lights were on, the door was unlocked, and the silence felt wrong before she even stepped inside. She explained that she called out for her parents and sensed immediately that something was terribly wrong. The quiet itself, she said, was unbearable. Her testimony was restrained and factual, yet deeply emotional. And even the judge appeared visibly affected. Romy did not speak with anger or accusation. Instead, she laid out the reality of a family that had spent years trying to hold itself together through therapy. Late-night conversations and repeated promises that tomorrow would be better. During cross-examination, defense attorney Alan Jackson approached her carefully, asking about Nick's long-standing mental health struggles and the signs that he had been unraveling well before the tragedy. After a brief pause, Romy acknowledged what the family had struggled to fully understand at the time. She said Nick was sick, and that none of them realized how serious it was until it was too late. The simplicity of her statement cut through the courtroom, silencing even seasoned reporters. Outside the courthouse, her testimony quickly became the focus of national coverage. Described as the moment that silenced Hollywood, the narrative shifted from crime alone to a deeper examination of emotional collapse, family pressure, and missed warning signs. That night, as Nick was escorted back to custody, one officer later recalled hearing him whisper that his sister should never have had to speak that truth out loud, though it never appeared in official headlines. Those words captured the depth of his remorse more clearly than any legal argument. As the trial continued, it became clear that the Nick Reiner case was no longer just about guilt or innocence. It was about the unraveling of a family shaped by love, pressure, and unspoken pain. What began as a private tragedy had grown into a public reckoning, forcing conversations about mental health, family expectations, and the unseen battles that can exist even behind fame and success. The case left Hollywood shaken and the public divided, confronting uncomfortable questions about responsibility, compassion, and whether justice can ever fully account for psychological collapse. The story of Nick Reiner became more than a headline. It became a reflection of how silence, emotional strain, and untreated trauma can distort even the deepest bonds. As the trial unfolded, one truth remained clear. This was not a simple story with easy answers. It was a painful reminder that behind public images and celebrated legacies are real people, flawed, vulnerable, and capable of breaking in ways no one expects. The conversation surrounding the case continues, not just in courtrooms and media coverage, but in broader discussions about mental health awareness, family dynamics, and the importance of recognizing warning signs before it's too late.